Good morning. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us for the free WEAT webinar today. Our topic today is what you should know before using the respirator, what TCEQ and OSHA have to say. We have a great group of speakers today, and we'll have a moderated panel discussion after the presentations. And now I'd like to introduce you to Josh Hathaway, who's going to be moderating our sessions today. Josh is the Environmental Compliance Manager of the North Texas Municipal Water District, where he works with the water, wastewater, and solid waste teams to ensure that regulatory guidelines are being met. Prior to North Texas, he served at the City of Dallas for 12 years in various environmental, regulatory, and process improvement roles. His experience there includes 5 years with Dallas Water Utilities, implementing and maintaining ISO 9000 quality, ISO 14000 environmental, and SAS 18000 safety management systems. Josh has a passion for continuous improvement and environmental stewardship. He holds a Juris Doctor from Louisiana State University Law School and a Bachelor's in Business Management from Louisiana Tech University. Josh, I want to thank you for moderating this session, and I'll turn it over to you now.
All right, thank you, Rick. Thanks for that introduction. I'm very excited to be here with these two panelists. I think we're going to have a great discussion at the end of the presentations. So again, please don't forget to submit your questions, and we'll try to cover all of them at the end. I've had the pleasure of working with both of these gentlemen, and they're definitely both experts in their field. First up, we have Joe Baldwin. Joe Baldwin is the president and senior consultant for Baldwin EHS Consulting. Not only does he teach OSHA's outreach training program, but Joe's training programs can also get his students TCEQ credits, which is very valuable for water districts. Joe is an active member of WEAT, and he co-chairs the Safety and Cybersecurity Committee, and Joe has 25 years of experience in the safety field. Up next is David Milligan. David is our new Health and Safety Manager for North Texas Municipal Water District. David is a board-certified safety professional with 30 years of experience in the safety field. He's a graduate of the Water and Wastewater Technical Schools in Missouri, and David holds a Master of Science degree in Industrial Technology from Texas A&M Commerce. With that, Rick, do you have any other questions before we get started? Then I will turn it over to Joe Baldwin to begin the presentations.
For some reason, I'm at the end of the presentation. Can we get back to the beginning? Okay. Thank you for joining us at the webinar this morning. We wanted to go over some information about respirators and wearing a respirator and some of the things that we should know before putting on a respirator. One of the first things I want to introduce and go over is choosing the correct respirator for the task. Not all respirators are created equal, and so we'll take a look at different types of respirators, what they can and can't do. Then there are some medical and physical conditions that are met, and then we'll also go over regulatory requirements for wearing a respirator. When we look at some of the regulatory requirements and where a lot of this information came from, we looked at different sources, what the TAC 30 has to say, TCEQ, and then also the OSHA standards. So the information that we're presenting here is referencing back to one of these references today as we go forward. When we take a look at respirators, there are two basic types. One is an air purifying respirator that utilizes a filter, and it filters the air that you're in and filters out contaminants that are in the air. Now, these can come in different styles, and we'll look at some styles here in a second. The other type of respirator is an air supplied respirator, where it's either an air tank, as in the case of an SCBA, where the person is actually wearing the tank with them, or a tank of compressed air and they're fed that through a hose. These are your two basic types of respirators. And as we take a look at an air purifying respirator, you can see on the left of your screen a half mask air filtering respirator, and on the other side is a full-faced filtering type respirator. Both of these respirators work basically the same by the wearer breathing air, ambient air, in through a filter cartridge. The cartridge then filters out the contaminant that would be in the air, and the person is breathing filtered air. One of the limitations of these, if you're in a low oxygen atmosphere, it does not add oxygen to the air that you're breathing. So the oxygen content of the air is important. Also to note the type of cartridge that is worn. Some cartridges are designated for specific hazards that are in the air, specific gases that are in the air. So choosing the right respirator with these, you also have to choose the right cartridge that goes with it based on the contaminant that you may be facing. The next slide you see here is of a air supplied type respirator. On the right is what we would typically say as an SCBA, or self-contained breathing apparatus. And with this one, the wearer actually wears the tank of breathing air with them. The example on the right is a filter that would be hooked to a hose and then feeds the wearer of the respirator filtered air through this. Both of these, also very good, also have some limitations. The self-contained breathing apparatus, the amount of air that you can carry, there's a limitation on amount of air. On the one that uses a filter cartridge with it that is feeding you, it's very important to use the right type of compressor that would go with this. So both of these are very good. And one of the things we need to do is understand the contaminants that we'll get into and some of the limitations that we are. So an air purifying respirator utilizes, as I said, a filter to filter the air. It's limited on the contaminants that the filter will take in. And once that filter has reached its maximum life, the person has to exit the area and replace the filter. It's important to note this does not provide any additional oxygen to the wearer. So if they're in a low oxygen atmosphere, this does not supply you with additional. When we look at some of the requirements, a half-face respirator is good for up to 10 times of the PEL, or the permissible exposure limit. You can look on your SDS and see what a permissible exposure limit for any contaminant is, and know that this one is good for up to 10 times of that PEL. The full-face respirator would be good for up to 50 times of PEL or less. As we take a look at an air-supplied respirator, on pressure demand, it's good for up to 1,000 times PEL, and then an SCBA is 1,000 times or more PEL. So you can see with the air-supplied respirator, we can be in higher concentrations than a filter mask would be in. That's why these are more common and popular in the water and wastewater, because of the contaminants that are liable to be present. When we look at some contaminants that are likely to be present in a water or wastewater industry, these also happen to be the 4 gases that a common 4-gas monitor will pick up. We see the first is H2S, or hydrogen sulfide. Hydrogen sulfide is a very common gas. It's produced by the off-gassing, the breakdown of a biomass. It is very common in the water wastewater industry. Another gas that is very common is methane. It also is a breakdown of hydrocarbons and is an off-gassing. CO, or carbon monoxide, is an off-gassing and is produced by the breakdowns of fossil fuels, or the incomplete combustion of fossil fuels. So the exhaust coming out the end of your truck or your vehicle, that would be, we could measure carbon monoxide. And the last gas would be oxygen. The air that we're breathing now is about 21% oxygen. As we take a look at the next slide, we'll see kind of where some of these gases might be found. So I'm just using an example here of a typical manhole. When we look at gases, they have different vapor densities. So the vapor density of methane is less than air, so it will rise in the air column. We'll find it up at the top. Carbon monoxide has an air density of about 0.97, so it's really close to air, but we would still find it towards the upper level. Hydrogen sulfide, we will find it somewhere in the midsection. And then if there's any other like a gasoline or heavier gas fumes, those would sink to the bottom of it. So as we're testing through an atmosphere like this, we have to do what's called stratospheric testing. Test down through the stratosphere because different gases can be hiding at different levels. So we have to, in all of this, is identifying the hazards that we might have, where they might be, and now we can choose the right respirator for our job. There is a medical evaluation that goes with wearing a respirator. A person who wears a respirator, it does put a physical burden on the person's breathing system. And a medical evaluation is what that does is it's an evaluation that the wearer is physically fit to put on a respirator. There is a stress on the respiratory system in wearing a respirator, and so when we look back on this, a medical questionnaire is very important so that we know that our employees are healthy and to wear a respirator. The employer provides the medical evaluation, determines the employee's ability to use a respirator. Also, a fit test is conducted, and a fit test is specific to the exact respirator the person is wearing. So it's size, manufacturer of that respirator to make sure that they get a good fit to their face. So we take a look at, make sure that the person can wear a respirator and that they are physically fit to do so. The employer also implements a written respiratory protection program. And what a program does is it just basically lays out all of the component parts of your respiratory protection program. Here's how to choose a respirator. Here's, our selection of respirators, and here's the documentation and the evaluations that are needed before we put on a respirator. Tight-fitting respirators must not be worn by employees with facial hair. And when we take a look at facial hair, some people say, well, what is facial hair? What is it not? I have heard of the interpretation of being more than 24 hours growth, but we have to take a look that there is nothing between the seal of the mask and the face itself. So what we're really wanting to do is make sure that there is a positive seal between there, because as we've seen, some of these gases that we might be dealing with can be lethal if our employees are exposed to them. Employees that might be allergic or sensitive to latex products, we need to make sure that we know that first in choosing a respirator, so we don't choose a respirator that would have any latex problems in it. Go to more of a silicone-based type product, and to make sure that we don't have a allergic reaction at that point. We get into the part of wearing glasses, and anything that would break the seal of the seal to the face, we want to take a look at. So if the side rails of your glasses now break that seal between the respirator and yourself, then we have to take a look at a different type. Now, they do make prescription safety glass inserts into the full face. Contacts are allowed. It's not necessarily suggested, but contacts can be worn with full face type respirators, not so much with the half mask respirators because they're not protecting the facial hair. They're not protecting the face. So as we look at a respiratory protection program, we see down at the bottom some of the Appendix A, which is the fit testing procedure, the user checklist procedure, respirator cleaning, medical evaluation, and employees using respirators. That Appendix D is the voluntary use of respirators, and that would be in a case of, say, a dust mask, when a employee is wearing it for their own comfort and protection, and not necessarily required to wear it by the employer. There's training that must go along with wearing a respirator, how to wear a respirator, when to wear it, how to clean it, how to store it, where to store it. So employees need to know about a respirator before they put it on to make sure that they know how it's cleaned, where it's stored, and that it's stored properly. Okay. We were going to take a look at a couple of incidents where a respiratory protection may have saved the lives of some individuals. I did an internet search and pulled down some information on Patel, Mississippi. This is one where it's a tragic case where a 45-year-old gentleman and a 20-year-old gentleman entered into a confined space. They were overcome by hydrogen sulfide gas, and they did not survive the incident. And I think I have gone right through several of what David was going to present. So don't want to take your thunder away from you, David, but I just kind of get on a roll here. Another accident was in Wichita Falls. There's two gentlemen that entered a lift station. We don't know all of the story from this because the gentleman never regained consciousness after this incident. We do know that one person was over near the working area. It is assumed that he ran out of air at that time. He popped his mask off in gasping for air and was overcome by hydrogen sulfide gas. A second worker made it partway up the ladder. He either suffocated in his mask or was overcome by H2S when he took his mask off to breathe at that point. They did not die immediately on the site. One worker lived for about a week, but he never regained consciousness. And the other worker survived for about a month. And then he passed away from exposure to hydrogen sulfide. So both of these were occasions, or this was an occasion where a respirator was being worn, but the limitations of the respirator were overcome because they ran out of breathing air. They were wearing SCBAs, but ran out of breathing air in the atmosphere, in the mask that they were carrying with them. So a very tragic incident that happened at Wichita Falls. It's pretty unfortunate. We can look on the internet and look at accidents and injuries that have happened within the water and wastewater industry itself. Most of the time it happens because either a contaminant was not identified, or the employees wearing the respirator either were not wearing the correct respirator for the job, or it was used in a way that they either ran out of air, their cartridges were overcome with the amount of gas, and they succumbed to the gases that were in the space. I know there are a lot of questions around respiratory protection, and a lot of the feedback that we have been getting from many different places as we were putting this webinar together. So one of the things we really wanted to do was have an adequate amount of time at the end of this to address as many questions as we possibly can. We have some questions with this, and then Josh Hathaway also has some other questions that we've been forwarded in. But please, if you have questions about respirators, your respiratory protection program, please send those questions in, and we would like to spend a good part of the duration of this answering your questions and talking about any other specific incidents that you may have.
All right, thanks, Joe. We're going to turn it over to David Milligan now for the additional presentation. And again, keep submitting your questions, and we'll have plenty of time at the end to have a discussion about what you guys are worried and wondering about.
Thank you, Josh. One of the challenges a lot of municipalities face is, does OSHA apply to us or not? One of the challenges is our reference documents. Texas Administrative Code, as it rolls down to the TCEQ sections, incorporates by reference in many different sections OSHA standards. So the one that we found is that 1910-134 is referenced inside Texas Administrative Code 30. So if you need any additional information or guidance on 29 CFR 1910 Part 134, recommend you go to one of your local OSHA education centers or your TCEQ authorized trainers and enroll in some of the classes that they have. Also, another good reference is OSHA.gov, where you can go through their online section and find more information and read the regulation for free without having to purchase it. But you can also download some of the handy small building compliance or small business compliance guide, fatal facts, worksheets, and compliance topic publication guides to help you in your questions and your concerns about respiratory protection. Another question that we saw were, what were the basic types of respirators? And as Joe discussed, there were two, air purifying and the supplied air. Name one of the common hazards that workers face in the water and wastewater industry. And again, any of these answers will suffice. And having a reliable, calibrated 4-gas monitor is of great help. Two medical conditions that we talked about that could prevent you or an employee from wearing a respirator. Any of the responses below will be a good answer. And when we look at some of the lessons learned from the accidents that Joe presented, respirators or properly using respirators and knowing their limitations and working within their limitations could have saved lives in the examples that Joe presented. That concludes the PowerPoint presentation for our discussion. Now I'd like to turn it back over to Josh for any facilitated dialogue or discussion or additional questions from the field.
Thanks. All right, thank you, gentlemen. I have a question of my own. When we're in an environment where we don't have to put on an SCBA because there is oxygen, a lot of our water and wastewater operators are exposed to chlorine, ammonia, sulfur dioxide, hydrogen sulfide. Is there one cartridge that they can choose for all of those gases? And a better way to ask this is, how do we know which cartridge we're supposed to use for those types of gases?
That's a good question, Josh. One of the first steps in selecting PPE is to locate your work site and do a hazard characterization of the hazards in the work site. Once you determine the hazards in the work site, then you can select the proper PPE, whether it's a respirator, a hard hat, boots, gloves. So I always refer back to the individual work site, the hazard characterizations in the work site, and then doing the hazard assessment and coming up with a PPE list to include respirator and proper filters. Over.
One question we've received is, how do we know when our cartridge is used up?
That's another good question, Josh. That requires some research based on the manufacturer and the respirator filter that's used, because some filters are susceptible to humidity and they're susceptible to the concentration of the chemical in the workplace. So some of them may have a shorter use life based on the chemical concentration, the temperature, and the humidity located in that individual work site. Over.
Okay. To follow up on that, also with cartridge type respirators, if you're in a high dust environment, wearing a pre-filter to that would also filter some of this dust out and expand that life. There's a myth that was out there, had been out there, that, hey, when you can start to smell the contaminant, it's time to get out. That is too late. Once you can smell it, your filter, your cartridge is exhausted, and you're being exposed to that. So as Dave said, we have to go back to the manufacturer's recommendation based on the PEL that is present, the contaminants that are present in the atmosphere, and make sure that our cartridge will protect us for a reasonable amount of time in that environment.
All right, I'd like to remind everyone to submit your questions at the dialog box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get them in real time and try to answer them. Let's see. Should respirators be inspected?
That's a good question, and the short answer is yes. Any personal protective equipment needs to be inspected, and especially if your life depends on it. So respirators need to be inspected on a routine basis. Some folks ask me, what is routine? It's, prior to use, and then SCBA should be inspected on a monthly basis, just to make sure that the tank is full of air, that the mask is clean and available for the user to use it at a moment's notice. Several of these things or several respirators would be used in an emergency basis. So on that, we want to make sure that the respirator is clean, properly stored, and inspected.
And who should do that inspection?
The authorized end user of the respirator, who's designated to be a member of the Respiratory Protection Program, needs to inspect it before use, but also after use when he's doing the service and the hygienic cleaning. Also, if you are a safety and health professional and you're doing an audit or a survey or an assessment, you should inspect the respirators as they're stored in the workplace. I had a chance to visit a hydropower facility that had a rescue team, and they had SCBA that they would don and doff as a part of a rescue scenario or a real rescue. I asked to inspect the SCBA. Every face piece was size small. Everybody in the building wore about a size 9 hat. So if they were to don that SCBA, they wouldn't be able to because the face piece was so small. So whenever you're going out, just because they're properly stored, you need to go a little bit further, check fittings, connections, service dates, expiration dates, and mask sizes to make sure that you have the correct mask size for the employees and that they know which size they wear over.
We've got someone who'd like to know if they can use Vaseline to make their mask fit better.
Well, we go back to the NIOSH standards and where it says that nothing should come between the seal surface of the respirator and the person's face. Vaseline would be a contaminant or material that we would put between the face and the seal. So the short answer of that is no. The long answer of that is there are some contaminants that may react with the Vaseline, knowing that it is a petroleum product. So if you're in an atmosphere of high oxygen or high ozone or something of that sort, you may create a greater hazard for yourself. So it is not recommended to use Vaseline. If a person is using Vaseline, that means that their face is not clean shaven. And so we go back to the to the clean shaven face policy. And so the short answer is no, and the long answer is no.
Okay. Let's talk about OSHA training. We've got some individuals who want to know what is the best way to locate a qualified training provider, and they need help with fit testing, hazard assessment, and policy development.
That's a good question, Josh. It depends on the type of training that you need. For general awareness training, OSHA has a list of authorized 10 and 30-hour card providers in your area. Also, if you need some additional OSHA training, OSHA does have a list of authorized OSHA education centers and a description of the curricula or the course topics that they'll provide. When you get going a little bit further down through and beyond TCEQ, it's up to the employer to do his or her due diligence in selecting a consultant, a training organization, or firm to provide the training. I always look for a training firm that follows ANSI standard 490.1, the accepted standards and practices for environmental health and safety training. I look for organizations that may be members of the ANSI or NFPA standards committee that create the training guidance and the standards guidance for the hazards that we're exposed to. And also for college credits or IACET CEU credits, I look for an IACET numbered provider. But there's a lot of great trainers and training organizations out there that work independently. I just encourage all end users and all employers to perform their individual due diligence and research who they want to come train their employees because their lives may depend on it. Over.
Another good source of that also, Dave, is to take a look at tceq.gov, and they also have a list of TCEQ authorized providers that can offer training that both meets the OSHA standard and would also have CEUs for their water wastewater operators. So you got a list of some really good resources to look for.
Joe, we've got a question here about where we can get a copy of these slides. Is that going to be available on WEAT's website?
Julie, this is Rick again. Yes, we'll get the slides published onto the WEAT website, usually within 2 or 3 days after the presentation. I just need to get you guys to send me the slides so we can get those.
Okay.
Okay, good.
Correct.
We will do that.
The slides as they were shown are currently published on the WEAT website at theweat.org/cybersecuritywebinar.shtml.
Julie's faster than I realized.
That's great. Someone specifically wanted to review the accidents that we were talking about, so we'll have that available to everyone. We did have those 4 questions posted. Those are your CEU questions. I'm going to return to those after our discussion, and we'll go over those one more time so that you folks can get your CEUs. So be ready to revisit that. Let's talk about shaving. So, what are your thoughts and what's going on in the industry with having someone be shaven all the time at work, or should they shave when there's an incident, shave on demand? What are you guys seeing out there in your past jobs, and what do you think best management practices are? Let me go to David first on that.
Thank you, Josh. Again, this is all based on hazards and established standards, either through Cal OSHA, Fed OSHA, or national consensus standards. And what I'm seeing, Josh, is this is a condition of employment, and that the majority of not the majority, but many organizations from NASA to Disneyland have professional personal grooming standards. And the employees know up front as a part of their position description and their job duties and their hazards that they have grooming standards that protect them in hazardous situations, whether it's the wear of a ponytail or a long beard where it may become entangled in a moving object, to having a clean-shaven face so they can don or doff in an emergency an SCBA or a respirator over.
Joe.
As a standard of industry, what I'm seeing, and as a consultant, I'm in many different work sites, many different locations. And as Dave said, it really does come down to the hazards that are present and the job description of the person doing it. If we have a person that would need to respond to an emergency situation and they show up with a full beard, it's like, oh, wait a minute, hold off here. Let me find some Brill cream and a Bic razor while I shave real quick, and I'll put a respirator, and now I'll come save you. So in an emergency situation where seconds can make the difference between life and death, having a clean-shaven face or having no facial hair between the seal of the respirator becomes critical and can become a life and death situation. So where I have seen in standard of industry, it is that, as David said, a condition of employment and grooming standards. There again, we would fall back to our policies and procedures. And if your organization is implementing a respiratory protection program, would require employees to wear respirators because a specific hazard is present, then within that policy, I would make sure that a clean-shaven policy is included in that.
How would you guys identify which members of an organization would be included in that?
That comes, Josh, from your site conditions assessment and your hazard analysis of what are the working conditions in the workplace, and then who are the employees who are affected employees and are members of an authorized entry team, an authorized rescue team, an authorized respiratory protection program team. So it comes down to the individual and the hazards the individual is exposed to in the workplace, and then the employer designating them as a member of the respiratory protection program and spells it out there in that policy over.
I want to encourage everyone to submit your questions. They seem to be slowing down, and we'd like to continue this discussion. Have you guys seen any incentives in the industry for folks that are included in a respiratory protection program? Joe?
Within that, anybody that would be on a confined space, either a confined space entry team or a confined space entry rescue team, would definitely be one place. Anyone that is on an emergency response, either be it first aid or fire response, I would see, those folks being underneath this policy. And then also in your specific plants, the operators within that plant and duties that fall underneath their job description. If an operator is required to go into a confined space that might have a high level of contaminants in the air, then most definitely they would need to be involved in the hazard community or in the respiratory protection program, and then fall under the guise of that and all of the regulatory requirements with that. So as David said, it really comes down to the employer and the job duty that each employee has within their organization, and to decide exactly who does and who doesn't. The one caution I have is consistency. Whatever you do, be consistent with it from one job to the next, from one plant to the next. So if an employee migrates or transfers to another plant, we have a consistent program between plants.
David, did you want to add anything about incentives?
Some employers look at exposure time. So if you are receiving hazardous duty pay, it may be for the hours or minutes that you're exposed to the hazard, not an extra bump in salary for the entire year. Some employers have a proficiency or currency pay where you're in a higher pay band based on your job duty, and some employers base it on the exposure to the hazard. So if I'm entering a confined space and it's 2 hours, for that 2 hour period, I get time and a half or double time based on the hazards. That boils down again to the individual employer, their human resource policies, and their salary policies that they have in place over.
I have a question about hazard characterization, especially stratospheric testing through the layers. Can you help us understand how does this work, this stratospheric testing, and when we should use different respirators? Let me split that up. Let's start first with the stratospheric testing.
As I mentioned on that one slide showing the typical manhole, if you will, or into a lift station, different gases have different vapor densities. We assess air as having a vapor density of 1. Anything that has a vapor density of less than 1 will rise in the air column. Anything with a vapor density of greater than 1 will sink in the air column. For instance, one of the things I pointed out was carbon monoxide. It has a slightly lighter than air vapor density to it, therefore it would rise in the air column. We'll take a common substance like PVC glue. The fumes that would be given off from PVC glue are 2.5 times heavier than air, so they would sink to the bottom of the air column. So as we do stratospheric testing, what we're doing is lowering a testing tube or the monitor itself through the stratosphere and picking up what those specific gases are and where they will be in the air column themselves.
The second part of the question is about when we should use the different respirators discussed, such as I may be wearing a respirator and situation changes and I need to go to an SCBA. Would you, David, you want to elaborate a little bit on those situations?
If you don't have enough oxygen, you need supplied air, whether through an SCBA or a supplied air line. And if you're going to a cartridge type respirator, it depends on the hazards in the environment to which respirator you would use. So you'd have to review your safety data sheet, but also what your monitors are telling you for the gas and the oxygen levels over.
I did see your slide on the different permissible exposure levels, which called for different levels of respiratory protection. How do you determine what the PEL is at that point in time?
Continuous monitoring and sampling is always a good start, but also doing your predictive monitoring or sampling based on some of your hazard exposures, and also doing some worst case analysis on what could be the worst case to prepare your workers. But continuous monitoring and developing a hazard profile over time by reviewing your records can help in your analysis, Josh.
Okay.
We do that. One of the things that I always say is do not problem solve while you're in a confined space or a hazardous atmosphere. Always get to a fresh atmosphere. Never stop and try to problem solve or change respirators in midstream. Always get to a known clean environment before changing respirators, changing cartridges, doing anything. So the word there is don't problem solve while you're in a contaminated atmosphere. Get out and then assess the situation or reassess the situation.
Is there any reason to not jump straight to an SCBA when a respirator might be effective? I've got David shaking his head over here. You guys can't see that.
When we take a look at respiratory protection, and it really goes back to the hazards that are present, and the hazards not only that are present, that have been there, are there, or could be there. We really have to take a look at what environment our employees will be going into and assessing those. As David said, we have to do some good investigation and looking back on our records, what was there, what has the great potential to be there. As we're looking at the different types of respirators, definitely our greatest protection is going to come with an SCBA. However, it does have limitations of how much time that you can be in there. A typical tank, a person normally breathing, not exerting themselves, that tank may last 25 to 30 minutes. Someone exerting themselves heavily in a space, it may last 15 to 20 minutes. So you really have to take a look at how long you need to be in that exposure. And then we might have to go to another type, maybe a mask that is fed fresh air from another source. In looking at just a filter type respirator, these are more are used as we saw in the PEL exposures, a much lower exposure limit that someone would be in. But definitely, if the anticipation is to be in an atmosphere of higher concentrations, then an SCBA or an air supplied respirator would definitely be the preferred choice.
David, if I have a fit test for a respirator or an SCBA, are they interchangeable, or do I need to be tested for both?
You need to be tested by the make, model, design, and series of respirator that you're going to use. So an SCBA fit test might be different than your half-face test or your full-face test. And when you do your respirator fit test, if you're doing a quantitative fit test, adapters are available for the different types of respirators to include, believe it or not, a two-strap N95
big dust mask.
Yeah, big fancy dust mask respirator. So as part of your program, you need to identify the user and which types of respirators that the user is authorized to wear.
And how often should those fit tests be performed?
We're doing them annually. When you look at the standards, look at your most restrictive standard that you've adopted, but also if anyone's had any changes in their life. For example, someone may have gone to dentures or changed their dentures or doesn't have dentures. Maybe they've had some facial reconstruction surgery. So anytime, or a major weight loss or major weight gain. So anytime someone's facial structure has changed, it may necessitate a respirator fit test and possibly a different size of respirator.
David, you brought up a good point there when we were talking about an N95 a dust mask or when a dust mask becomes a respirator. When you look at a box of dust masks, it does say respirator on there. The difference is, as the employer, once we have identified a hazard and have identified this dust mask or this respirator to protect our employees from that hazard, we have deemed it a respirator. You saw on one of the slides that I showed that the voluntary use of a dust mask. That would be for, in an instance, we have workers that are exposed to some nuisance dust. There's no particular hazard associated with it, and they're wearing it for their own personal comfort. That's not a problem. We just need to make sure to fill out the document, have it on file, and it's good. But if we have identified a hazard that can or has hurt someone in the workplace, and now recommend an N95 two-strap type dust mask, now it becomes a respirator, and we have to follow the same respiratory guidelines with the medical evaluation and the fit tests and all with that type of dust mask. So it really comes down to the hazards that we're exposed to.
Along with the fit test, the medical evaluation is required. What are your feelings about the movement towards online medical evaluations versus seeing a doctor, Joe?
I have seen and have worked with some of the online solutions. Today in our techno world, we really like to seek online solutions. I think it is a viable answer, but I go back to the personal touch. When you are talking with a medical provider, they are both looking at you, assessing your answers along with that medical evaluation. So I go back to talking with a medical provider. I always see as more beneficial than an online survey would be, because we can be anything we want to be online, but when we're standing face to face with someone, then we get a better evaluation. David, what are you seeing in online?
I don't have enough background information to have a solid opinion on it. So, pending further research, I've got no comment on it.
One thing I've noticed is the providers that used to do this in person are moving away from it, and I think it's spurred by the online programs through 3M and several others. Is there a specific cartridge for ozone, for low dose concentrations of ozone exposure?
Yes, there are, but depending on the concentrations in your program, you need to do your research to find which type that you would need. If you Google and look at some of the vendors online, they will describe their N95 or their 100 series for ozone, but you'd have to do your own research with what your concentration levels are and what type of respirator that you're using, and then make your individual selection for the hazards.
Where can we find some of these guidelines?
Definitely with your respirator manufacturers, referring back to the information from the manufacturer themselves. There's a lot of good information. If you go to 3M or MSA online, you can find a lot of really good information on the cartridges that they provide and the substances that they will protect the wearer from. So I would say go back to the manufacturer and look at their data and see what they have provided online, and then we can always call and talk with a representative that can help you wade through some of that to find the exact cartridge or type of respirator that you might need.
And Josh, there is an ANSI standard for employee exposure to ozone. Mm-hmm. So I would always remind our audience to check with consensus standard, state and federal law, anything from NIOSH to CDC or the American Conference on Governmental Industrial Hygienists for standards that they may use and apply in their work site over.
Okay, great. Are these respirator cartridges only for acute exposure, or do they offer protection from low-dose chronic exposure also? Joe?
Acute exposure is right now chronic stands for over a long period of time exposure. There again, we go back to the manufacturer's information, and we go back to see the level of protection that an employee would receive in wearing that type of cartridge. Not to keep going back to it, but we really have to go back to the manufacturer's recommendations, and then also back to our own data on what hazards are there, what contaminants are there, what levels are they in or have the potential to be, to make sure that our employees are protected to an acceptable level. So the difference between chronic and acute is just the duration of exposure. Just an acute toxin can have immediate health effects, where a chronic toxin, used for an example, asbestos, would be over a long period of time. If we do have employees that are involved in a contaminant that could have long-term effects, then we need to make sure that our employees are protected from that, i.e. asbestos fiber or whatever the contaminant may be.
David, are there any storage recommended practices for where respirators should be kept or how they should be accessible?
Yes, there are, and again, it depends on the environment, but all respirators are to be stored, I want to say properly, with the manufacturer's guidance, but also in an area where they're accessible based on the time constraints that you require. You don't want to store them in a caustic, corrosive atmosphere where they would deteriorate quickly. So you want to make sure that you do an assessment of the hazards in the storage location, and then make sure that they can be stored in a hygienic condition, because that's the sanitary conditions are very important for those who wear the respirator.
As someone who wears glasses myself, I'm wondering, does anybody have experience with the lens inserts that go into a respirator mask, and how well do they work? Go ahead, David.
It depends on, I hate to say it, the user and the prescription. But one of the challenges is prescription eyewear as a part of PPE. So if you do make the option to buy the respirators and have the glass frames as a part of the kit, make sure that you have a current prescription, and make sure that you can purchase the lenses and as a part of the inserts, so your employees can work without glasses in the workplace. Also, contact lenses, may or may not be an option for an employee, so you definitely need to make sure you explore that option and set your employees up for success.
Okay. We're coming close to the end of our Q&A session. If you guys have any additional questions you'd like answered, please use the box at the bottom of your screen to submit those, and we'll answer those. So we've had a few employees who have said that since respirators are positive pressure, there's no way a contaminant can get in, therefore it's not necessary to be clean shaven. How would you guys respond to that?
It depends on the worker and the employee. If you're using a hooded respirator that's positive air pressure, and your safety and health professional or your industrial hygienist has deemed this as the right countermeasure to abate the hazard, and that's your employee's policy in the workplace, that's fine. But again, that's assuming you don't have to wear FCBA, you don't have to wear a tight-fitting respirator to do the work, that you can actually use that type of pressurized system in the workplace. But again, it's got to be hazard dependent, and it's got to be consistent as a part of your human resource or your safety policy.
David, as a follow-up on that, just to give people kind of a visual idea of what we're talking about, a hooded type, a hood like a sandblaster would wear, a hooded type respirator that fits over the entire head and is not dependent on the seal between the respirator and the face, but it is being fed fresh air to the user within a hood. That is different than the two types of respirators that we have talked about here. So I just wanted to give a little bit of clarity on a hooded type respirator as opposed to a tight-fitting respirator.
Would a hooded respirator be a good alternative for someone who, say, has 10 years of beard growth, does not want to cut their hair? Certain organizations also have individuals who do not shave for religious reasons. If they needed to go into a situation where there was an ammonia or chlorine release, is a hooded respirator going to be an effective way to protect them?
We have to look at the limitations that are present. If someone is going into a wide open environment and they can walk in, a hooded type respirator could be a viable answer in those situations. But we really have to take a look at the exposure, the limitations, and can the employee conduct work while wearing that. With a hooded type respirator, you do have some mobility issues that would be involved. You have some field of vision limitations that would also be involved. So we really have to take a look at the situation. And to give you a carte blanche answer, I can't do that, but we have to take a look at each situation as it arises and why are we looking into this special condition over a standard SCBA type exposure.
And that comes down to the employer doing a job hazard analysis or an activity hazard analysis, and then setting a standard policy based on the hazards and the work conditions, Josh.
And I imagine this is another situation where you have to look at the PEL and see if the respirator would even be effective. All right, good to know. We have had a lot of questions about beards, and I think a lot of people are trying to find a way around it. Can one of you guys walk us through the steps for conducting a thorough fit test?
There are two types of fit test. One is qualitative and the other is quantitative. I'll speak to qualitative and then I'll let Dave speak to quantitative. A qualitative fit test is we're just testing the quality of the fit between the wearer and the respirator. So a solution like a Bitrex solution, which is a bitter, a saccharin type solution, which would be a sweet solution. And then we place a fit test device over the person's head and actually pump that in and see if, as they breathe, as they go through some exercises and some voice exercises, are they picking up any of that either bitter taste or sweet taste in there? So what we're doing is we're testing the quality of the test itself.
Joe, aren't we really relying on them to tell the truth, though, in that type of solution?
Yes, we are relying on them to tell the truth, but then also realize that their life depends on it.
Wouldn't it be better to use an irritating agent so we could observe if they are tearing up or coughing?
There are some of those irritative. The problem is if someone is slightly asthmatic, you can put them into an asthma attack. So we have to be very sensitive with with the type of either irritant, smoke, or the type of solution that we to start with. The other thing under a qualitative is, or even wearing a respirator, is making sure the person is not claustrophobic. In conducting a fit test in my distant past, I had a lady who was just fine until I put that test mask over her face, and she came completely unglued. And come to find out, she was claustrophobic. That was a question that I should have asked up front to find out. So in choosing the right type of solution on doing a qualitative fit test, is just going back and asking, hey, is anyone asthmatic? And then we also have a solution that you can test employees beforehand. It's a very watered down or a weaker solution to make sure that they can sense the taste or sense the bitter taste in and of itself. So it really comes down to the employee and the honesty between the employer and the employee. And employees need to understand it's for their benefit and it's for their for their own safety and health. Dave, can you elaborate a little bit more on qualitative?
Quantitative.
Quantitative, I'm sorry.
For quantitative, it's very key that you ensure that the folks have had their medical exams up front and they're medically qualified to go through the exams. Second, budget at least an hour of time to do it. Make sure that you follow the manufacturer's instructions for the equipment they're using. Make sure it's been calibrated and tested as it's supposed to be. Make sure that you follow the OSHA or the NIOSH or the guidelines that you're using for the proper fit test. And organizations I've worked with, like Quantitative, where we can get a printout of the employee's performance with it, and make sure that if you can't get enough quantity, you may have to have a small tent, like a shower tent, or a tent where someone can sit in to make sure you can get a high enough concentration of what you're using to get proper readings during your quantitative fit test. Over.
It sounds like the quantitative tests elude some of the issues with qualitative, where we're asking someone if they can smell or taste, and how the test is going for them.
And that
tells us.
And that's a challenge with qualitative. Sometimes, again, if, like Joe says, if you do a pre-test up front so people know what they're supposed to smell, they'll smell it. But if someone's, again, not up front, or maybe has some sort of olfactory challenge, or really needs the job and really needs the job and do what they need to get hired. So the quantitative test gives you a date, time-stamped document, if you've done things correctly, that you can use as a documentation piece of your respiratory protection program.
We have a very strong question that came in, and we can't give legal advice here, so I'm going to touch on it very quickly, but I'm not going to ask the panelists to answer this. It's, can you speak to the legal ramifications to the employer if they do not enforce proper fit testing with their employees? Basically, if you don't enforce proper fit testing, then you're not meeting the OSHA requirements, and we'll leave it at that. In addition to asthma, are there any other medical conditions or medications that can cause problems with a fit test? Joe?
There definitely are. As I mentioned, asthma or any breathing condition, if a person has a problem with their lungs, their respiratory system, there definitely could be some problems there. Claustrophobia is another situation. We need to ask those questions up front, and then also ask your employees, are they on a type of medication? Because if they have a cold, or they've have a problem, some restriction in their lungs, then it definitely can affect the fit test at the time. So we want to make sure that when you do a fit test, that some questions are asked up front. Are you feeling okay today? Do you have any respiratory problems? I've even seen where allergy situations has hindered the person being able to breathe deeply enough. And because wearing a respirator does put restrictions on your breathing, if there's any conditions that the employee is suffering at the time, it will definitely have or could have an effect on the outcome.
David, for smokers, is there a time frame where they should not smoke prior to a fit test or using respirators?
20 years.
Yeah, that's kind of a loaded question for all those smokers and vape users out there, Josh, both recreational smokers and professional smokers. So I'd like to leave that one alone and refer people to their licensed professional healthcare provider for personal health and personal lifestyle choices.
Okay, good to know.
In conducting that test, it does say don't, eat, drink anything 30 minutes beforehand. So when it comes to, eating something or drinking a soda pop or something like that, would definitely recommend 30 minutes prior to the test, and smoking, we'll leave that one alone.
What are the record-keeping requirements for fit testing?
Josh, I hate to say I never rely on my memory. I always go back and check and double check.
That's okay.
So looking at the TAC and the TCEQ requirements, balancing those off of OSHA, and then the hazard communication standard with what are they exposed to. So sometimes the exposures, what they're exposed to, can have an impact on the record keeping. So I would just say go back and double check, do a vertical search and a horizontal search to make sure that you're applying the right standards to the hazards that we're exposed to over.
Joe, I know you've taught the class recently. Do you remember any specific record-keeping requirements for fit testing specifically?
Okay, specifically to fit testing, realizing that this is it is a medical questionnaire. When we're doing the questionnaire, fit testing are done, typically done annually. I always, tell folks to keep at least 5 years of documentation when it comes to their training, their fit testing, their medical evaluation. So if there is a case, we can always look back and refer back to, did this employee have a problem in the past, to relating it to now. So I would say using the 5-year rule of thumb, if you will, to maintain those records so that you can always refer back to those. Again, as David mentioned, go back and do a greater search on record keeping and the retaining of records.
I assume somebody asking this question needs an answer. Would they refer to 1910-134?
They would, but they may need to drill down into asbestos, or maybe they're in an industry that might have beryllium or uranium or some of those heavy type metals. They may be in an organization where the standard is 1 or 5 year record retention, but their organization requires lifetime record keeping or the life of the employee plus 30 years for legal protection or lawsuit protection. So it really depends on what standards you're operating on, industry best practices, and then what your company has determined is their best legal protection. Josh?
If that question came from an NCMWD employee, our record retention policy is forever.
Okay.
What is your take on blood pressure testing before suiting up in an SCBA?
Josh, my recommendations always are have a medical qualification and medical surveillance programs that are hazard based. So as people grow in an organization, as people age in an organization, both the employee and the supervisor can be aware of our changing health conditions, and we can adapt our job practices to protect the workers and their co-workers from our individual health condition.
Right.
For example, I hate to admit it, but we already said I've been in safety and health for 30 years. I'm at the age, if I'm going to wear SCBA, I have to get on the treadmill and work the incline. And I'm in pretty good shape, and it seems to take longer and longer and longer every year for me to hit my target heart rate for someone to sign off that I can wear an SCBA. So if I can, I try to find a job where I don't have to wear it because I don't like to do the dreaded treadmill. But that's based on, again, your organizational policy and following the program and making sure you have a licensed professional healthcare support team that can do those individualized medical surveillance. Also, for some medications may make people more susceptible to heat stroke or a heat injury. So having that discussion with your personal licensed healthcare professional on what medications you are on and how that may make you susceptible to a heat injury at your work site are important dialogues to have. And then again with your team leader at work. Over.
All right. Can we go to the slides with the questions on them? We're going to review the CEU questions very quickly. Give us just a second. All right. Do cities and municipalities fall under OSHA? We may not fall under the jurisdiction of OSHA. However, the TAC has adapted by reference many OSHA requirements, including respiratory protection, found in 29 CFR 1910-134. We know that a lot of new wastewater plants have incorporated most of OSHA, and for the old plants, there's bits and pieces of OSHA required. So that is a loaded question. What are the basic types of respirators? Air purifying respirator, supplied air respirator, and self-contained breathing apparatus. Name one of the common hazards that workers face in the water and wastewater industry. Any of the following will answer this question: low oxygen, flammable gas, hydrogen sulfide, or carbon monoxide. Name 2 medical conditions discussed in this presentation that could prevent you from using a respirator. Any of the following will suffice: a heart condition, lung disease, or a psychological condition like claustrophobia. Name 1 case presented in this webinar in which the use of respirators could have saved lives. We very briefly talked about the wastewater lift station in Petal, Mississippi, a wastewater lift station in Wichita Falls, and the sewer pipe repair in Montgomery, Alabama. When you pull this presentation off of WEAT's website, that slide will have more details. Jerry, can you find that slide quickly? I think David has the... There you go.
Yeah, that's it.
So there are more details on the presentation that you can download from WEAT. And again, these questions that we just went over are for your continuing education credits, and there will be instructions to submit those. I'm going to turn us back over to Rick Hidalgo. Rick, would you like to add anything or give instructions for the CEUs?
Josh, I appreciate it, and I want to thank Joe and Dave for their insight into this. I guess just before we end it, I'd like to ask, oh, it looks like there's one more question that's come up. Back to blood pressure testing, would you recommend having a monitor on hand at all times if sitting up was needed in an emergency?
Joe, would you answer that?
Blood pressure is a condition of life. Anyone that would have a high blood pressure condition, if they're on medications, they definitely need to let their immediate supervisors know if that is a situation. Having a blood pressure cup on site, I personally, in my experience, have never encountered that. And there again, in an emergency situation, hey, hang on a minute, let me take my blood pressure before I don this SCBA to come in and save your life. So I haven't seen it, nor would I recommend it. David, can you add anything else?
And it also depends on the individual. I spool up very slowly in an emergency situation. I have coworkers who spool up very quickly in an emergency situation. Their blood pressure gets pretty high, but that's a human condition for flight or fight. And some people respond to emergency with elevated blood pressure. Some people go in pretty calm. So it's kind of the luck of the draw, but that's, again, where your medical qualification surveillance program comes in consultation with your licensed private or personal health care provider.
All right, thank you, Joe. And I'm going to turn back over to you. Go ahead.
Thanks a lot, guys. And Dave, just one final thought. As a health and safety manager for one of the larger utilities in the area, any final thoughts that you can provide to some of the other utilities that are on the call of recommendations or things that you've had to address that successfully with regard to respirator fit testing or use of respirators?
I think the key is a commitment to lifelong learning and remembering that there's things that we can relearn over time to be grounded in the standards and grounded in good practices. Doing your work site hazard characterizations and assessments to make sure you have a good inventory of those locations, making sure you develop some standard protocols for your medical qualification, surveillance, and respiratory protection program. And when in doubt, reach out. There's a lot of great peers that we have in our network that may look at a program or a problem a little bit differently or from past experiences. So I just urge everyone to stay connected in the health and safety community and make sure you continue to support great organizations such as WEAT and continue to be a part of the community. Over.
Thanks, Dave. Joe, as a safety consultant, I'm sure you work with a lot of different utilities. Any closing thoughts that you may have as far as recommendations?
The recommendation is going back to have a good, solid policy that is based on regulatory compliance. If you're looking at TCEQ, if you're looking at OSHA, that your policies and procedures are consistent with the regulatory standards, and whatever you do, be consistent. If we have one standard at a plant and we have multiple plants within our jurisdiction, then we stay standard. If that be in standardization of policy and fit test and procedure, or if that be in standardization of types of respirators that we have from one location to the other, or manufacture of respirator from one plant to the next. As David elaborated a little bit earlier, a fit test is specific to a respirator, the type of respirator, the manufacturer recommendation of the respirator. So just consistency, I would say, is a large part of that. So make sure your programs and policies are based on best practices, and that it's consistently applied across the organization.
Thanks, Joe. And again, gentlemen, on behalf of the Safety and Security Committee, I'd like to thank you for putting this presentation together. It was very informative. Appreciate the time that it took to pull all this together. As you'll note, on the three gentlemen speaking, it stated that they were actually Jim Shirley. Jim Shirley was instrumental in also helping to pull this together, but he was not able to be on the call today. And then last but certainly not least, I'd like to thank Julie Nargon for helping to coordinate these webinars for the Safety and Security Committee. She does a great job of herding cats and getting us all in the same direction as we continue to present these for you. We do have another webinar coming up on October 18th. It's focused on security best practices for unmanned water facilities. We'll look at remote sites, remote lift stations, mud districts that may not have, that are going to have smaller locations spread out through a large area, and what we need to do for addressing security from that standpoint. So again, as always, the Safety and Security Committee is very interested in providing these training sessions, learning sessions for you as the attendees, and we'd like your feedback. We'd like to hear what you think of them. Certainly would like to hear if there's any ideas on topics that you'd like to hear about in the future, and we'll certainly do our best to try to accommodate that and get the right speakers and the right expertise on these presentations so they can try to address your needs. Again, thanks for everybody for joining us. If you do have any ideas or on thoughts on what we might want to present, you can send your suggestions to Nyla Langford at nblangford@sig-auto.com. It's shown there on the screen. And again, I want to thank everybody for taking time to sit through this webinar. We hope to see you on October 18th. Goodbye.